we're going to look here why the Vermont real estate economic dude is just way too bullish on Vermont housing, or at least I think is not properly recognizing the downsides that are possible here. So first thing I want to do is look here. So on the left, I've got data from Fred. This is the resident population in Chittenden County. And you can see it's gone up about 70% in the last 50 years. That is not huge population growth. I think this is probably underrepresented more than most places because there's such a high student population, and that student population often does not update their residency. I was not even a student, and I know I lived in Burlington as a 20-something. I had out-of-state plates on my car. I had an out-of-state license. This is really pretty typical for those in their early 20s that are just getting out of the home, maybe still somewhat dependent on their families. And there's a lot of that in Burlington. The population, student population, undergrad population, pretty high in Burlington, certainly compared to the United States as a whole. So anyway, I just want to show that the huge demand in housing, this is really more of a marginal thing, meaning this is not huge population growth, but somewhat higher. Price growth is growing much higher than population. And that really shows us, at least shows me, that it's a supply side issue. Because things are sold at the margin and there's a limited supply, if you want to be the one to get the thing, you need to offer materially more than the average price. And if there's just that constant demand over and over, that's how you get these prices, especially Stowe. Look at this. So anyway, that's one. I just want to show population growth on the one hand. The other thing I want to show is the all transactions housing price index. And I want to talk about the great financial crisis and when the great financial crisis really started. So the great financial crisis is really, we say it was late 2007. By the way, it's December. I don't want to get too much into the next financial crisis that may or may not be around the corner, but in any case, so the great financial crisis, end of December, or end of 2017, and you can see that pretty well reflected here. So if we look at the housing actually tops in 2001, and by here, it's starting to go down. But the great financial crisis, boom, and then here's the recession. Q1 2008. And then from there, Q1 2008, we go from 372 to 308, about maybe a 20% drop. Not peak to trough, but the recession start to trough. So we have a little bit of a dip before the recession actually gets, and the great financial crisis officially starts. So let's compare that to what's going on. Let's look at, can we do this? We can. So can I actually keep only? So let's look at Vermont as a whole first. Vermont as a whole, you can see flattens out in 2007, 2008 and it goes down in 2009. So pretty flat here, you can see in Vermont. And I think that this is largely what Vermont Economic Realtor is referring to. However, Vermont is a tiny little place, but it's still much bigger than a actual housing market. So if we look instead, if we go first to Chittenden County, I think from my perspective, it's where most of the growth is in Burlington, or I'm sorry, in Vermont. That's where the colleges are and where most of the economic activity is at, and that's where people want to be. So if we look at if we look at Chittenden County, we can see, I just want to again point out here, all US, we peak Q1 2007 so we're still here. Same thing, about peak in county. But now let's see if we go more to Burlington itself. And I think this is where we start to maybe get the heebie-jeebies just a little bit differently. So let's look at the Burlington housing market. And this is let's remember, Burlington housing market is largely what drives the Vermont housing market, but it doesn't entirely drive it. There's a lot of stuff on the outskirts that's not super valuable, not 400 grand median price, but then there's farmland and stuff that's cheap. But then there's places like Stowe, Middlebury. There's little pockets of really expensive places. And so if we look at Burlington goes on this epic sort of bubble, but it stops in 2005. And what we see is that by 2008, Vermont's like over the bubble. And I think that I think this is like an accident. I don't really know what was going on here, but presumably it was just like a lot of people recognizing over this time period. And this is when I moved to Burlington at this time. But nonetheless, we can see that there was Burlington had its own epic housing rise and bubble. And that's not even the same as all of Vermont. And that's really just what I want to point out, is that Vermont as a whole has much more closely follows what the United States as a whole did. But Burlington had its own bubble that had already burst by the time the financial crisis had come around. We had 3 years of stagnant prices before there was a big turn in the market in Burlington. Why is that different? Because if you look at housing today in Burlington, and I'm not saying that we are going to have a Great Recession, another major financial crisis or anything like that, but if we do have another downturn, significant downturn, and the entire market drops before the local housing, which has not really burst yet, the local housing has maybe 6 months at best right now of this sideways behavior, and very few sales in the meantime. Probably less sales than are being sold here. Probably way less. So the market is not moving. It's not like letting off the pressure. This is a lot of pressure getting let off in this sideways period. There's not a lot of pressure having been let off yet. So if that big macro-wide downturn happens, there's a lot more pressure built up today in the Burlington market than there was in 2007. So that's like the main thing I wanted to show. And so if we also go back here and we look at Stowe, I think this is going to be more indicative of what we could see in Burlington. So we can see in Stowe was a little bit late. Stowe was maybe slightly ahead, barely, so they peaked here in 2006. They were already down a little bit in 2007. But Stowe, and I think Stowe back then is much more like Burlington today. Stowe had a peak to trough, median 400, average 500, to median 280, average 384. That's a much, much bigger peak to trough than people to quote in Vermont as a whole. We have these big run-ups here. Stowe in particular, probably in for another one of these, very luxury sort of place there. But yeah, I'm expecting Burlington to maybe look a little bit more like this time. Maybe not too crazy, but if we're at medium home price of 400, average of 450, I think we could really get down to 375 average, 350 median pretty easily. That's not the most likely scenario, but I do think if there is a significant downturn across the macro environment, like we do enter a recession, this time Burlington has more room to go down. If we do not have a recession, If we do have a sort of soft landing or even sort of stagflation, but not major turmoil, just maybe a higher baseline of inflation by a couple percent, maybe a tiny little recession or like flat growth for a few years, that could definitely be, that could also be what very likely happens here over the next several years in Burlington. What that means for buyers and sellers, really both, I think sellers have a lot more downside at the moment than buyers by waiting. So if I were a seller today, I would want to be just getting that thing sold. If I were a buyer, I think it's not too risky to buy right now. If you really want to move, if you need to move, and you're going to be there for a long time, 5 years probably is like the minimum, maybe even 10-year minimum. Maybe 5 to 7 years. You just don't care. I think 5 to 7 year time frame, you buy a house in Burlington, that house is going to be worth more money. It's just going to be way better than renting over that sort of time period. But if you're talking about a 2-year time period, 3-year time period, I would be a little hesitant to be buying right now. I think if you can wait, there's very little downside to waiting, and there's quite a bit of room for the price to go down, much more room than there is for the price to go up in the short term. And I guess that's it.